Welcome, everybody. Sorry to be a few minutes late. We were just being challenged with some technical difficulties, but we are ready to get this webinar started. So thank you all for participating this afternoon. My name is Natalie O'Rourke. I'm the Executive Director of the Oncology Foundation, and I'm just excited to be here with you this evening to kick off the Foundation's new Survive and Thrive webinar series. We are excited to do this as an extension of our Survive and Thrive Symposium. We are thankful to Nicole Hodac to be our first presenter and for leading our discussion on embracing your nutrition holiday season. I wanted to to start the webinar with an icebreaker, and really want to get a feel for the audience today on the webinar. So a poll is going to pop up here in a second. And I want to know how many of you are a survivor, a caregiver, or a provider. So take a minute and do the quick poll on your screen, and let me know who you are, what you're doing, how you're participating with us. All right, well, poll was great. Keep answering the questions you haven't yet, but it looks like a majority of survivors on the call. We have quite a few healthcare providers and caregivers on the call, so thanks for joining us. I really think that this topic can reach all audiences and you'll enjoy it. Let's go with maybe one more question. How many of you have attended one of our Survive and Thrive symposiums? Okay, so those numbers are coming in, and based on the poll, it looks like a majority haven't come to a Survive and Thrive symposium. Well, let me tell you that in 2018, we have 5 Survive and Thrive symposiums planned around the state. So go to our website, go to texasoncologyfoundation.org, and look at the list of symposiums and find one near you. We will be in Houston, Austin, Longview, Dallas, Beaumont. Find one. They are amazing. I think you'll have a great experience. So let me just, we are running, I want to keep things timely, so let me just hand this over to Kelly Condon. Kelly Condon is our program coordinator. She's going to review some housekeeping announcements, and then she will introduce our speaker, Nicole Hodac. Kelly, you want to take it over?
Absolutely. Thank you. We're so excited to have you with us for this first webinar. Just a few housekeeping things so you know how to use your control panel, which should be on the right side of your screen. First of all, please feel free to submit any questions you have during the webinar. There's a question tab on your control panel, and you can type in any questions you want throughout the presentation and just hit submit. If you're reviewing along with others at a site, please designate a scribe to submit your group's questions. We plan to respond after the presentation, so keep them coming. We may not have time to respond to all questions, but we do want to know what's on your mind. This will help us in our future planning of webinars. If you're experiencing any trouble, simply closing and reopening the webinar window usually fixes any issues. And if you're experiencing problems with your audio, the best solution is to call in the webinar. And on your control panel, if you select phone call, the number you need to dial will appear. This webinar is being recorded, and the online will be available after this live version. The recording will be sent to everyone in the audience in our following email. There's also a handout available to you on your control panel. It's under the handouts tab. And just like the poll that you just participated in, there will be a few throughout the presentation, so please select your answer, and we'll continue on with our presentation. Right now I'm going to introduce to you our presenter. Nicole Hodac is with us this evening. She is an oncology dietitian with the Texas Oncology Baylor Sammons Cancer Center. I actually had the opportunity to hear her speak at our Survive and Thrive Symposium in Arlington this past October. It is so evident her passion for nutrition, and she really has worked diligently to improve the care of her patients by being their nutritional support throughout treatment and even beyond in their survivorship. We are thankful for her continued support and participation with the foundation. Thank you for being with us tonight, Nicole, and we are excited for the opportunity to hear from you.
Hi, thank you all so much, and thank you, to the foundation, especially for having me and inviting me to kick off the series. When the idea was first presented to me, I'll tell you that I jumped at the opportunity because food is such a big component of any celebration, really, and nutrition is something that I feel strongly that it should be celebrated. So I hope that you are able to walk away today with some new information and strategies to be able to thrive through this season. Just as an overview, specifically what we'll cover today are the survivorship guidelines that are put out by the American Institute of Cancer Research. And these guidelines are put out for cancer prevention, but they're also put out for application to survivors as we strive to do things like prevent cancer recurrence or development of new cancer. And so we're going to take this and apply it to the holiday season because that's really where a lot of times we can be challenged with things like emotions, lack of time, stress, and also, just busy or just a lack of time because of the fact that we're doing things that we thoroughly enjoy. And so sometimes our plans, our best laid plans, can get away from us. And we'll do that through different types of food choices, those power-packed foods for the holiday menu, and then strategies as well. So we're going to kick off our, I guess, not our first poll, but our first poll for the presentation. How many pounds does the average person gain during the holiday season? Okay, the answer is actually 1 to 2. And what's interesting about this is that most people don't quite realize just how much weight is gained during the holiday season. Most people would say somewhere between 5 and 7 or 9 and 10, but the reality is it's 1 to 2 pounds. And we might say 1 to 2 pounds, that's so minuscule and so unimportant, but the problem is that it tends to stick with us. That's what we do see, is that we keep it for life. And when you talk about that during the holiday season, plus an additional pound that is also known to be commonly gained throughout the year, we're talking about 20 pounds in your 40s and 20 pounds in your 50s, and that can be a bad recipe for disease risk. And so this first guideline that you see at the top here, be as lean as possible without becoming underweight, is the first guideline for cancer risk reduction. And what's so important about this is that over and over in the literature, we see that overweight and obesity is tied to cancer risk. But also, more importantly, we may just be actually doing justice to ourselves to just prevent any more weight gain. So I think that's one of the key points that we want you to take away with this, is that throughout the holiday season, we want you to be realistic about the holiday season, still be able to enjoy the time, enjoy the experiences, and enjoy your nutrition and embrace it, but just do it in a way that you're able to maintain your body weight. So we're not actually gaining that 1 to 2 pounds. And so if you're curious as to where you stand, this next slide really gives you an idea of what we use commonly, and that's our BMI chart. And that stands for body mass index, and that's really a height to weight ratio calculation. And if you look at your height, on the left-hand column there, and you were to follow that over to about where your weight falls, and then drop that down to the bold numbers at the bottom, that would tell you where your BMI is. And those numbers, like I said, are relative to risk. So when we look at the BMI categories, those numbers, the number that you got for yourself, for example, is where you would fall in these categories: underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese. Another way to actually look at that is through waist circumference. And what's important about that is that we tend to see in the literature, again, that those who maintain or those who acquire body fatness around the waist they tend to also acquire fat mass in their around their vital organs. And so taking a tape measure and actually bringing that around the waist at the tip of the hip bone, if you were to look at what those numbers look like, if it was greater than 31.5, that would be an increased risk for women, and greater than 37 inches would be an increased risk for men. So that's where we are on weight, and that's where this first guideline comes in. So this just kind of gives you an idea of where you stand. But all the other guidelines that we're going to talk about are going to tell you how to kind of keep your weight stable, maintain your weight, or even to lose weight. And not only that, but these guidelines will also go through disease risk, because cancer is not just the full picture. There are other things that are also attributed to cancer risk as far as having and carrying other diseases. So being physically active for at least 30 minutes a day. There are so many benefits that come along with being physically active. And of course, since we're talking about cancer risk, that's a huge one, is just being physically active for 30 minutes a day. And it's that moderate activity. And so if you're thinking about what that means to you or what that would be for you, if you couldn't carry a conversation while doing that physical activity, it's too much. And so just be mindful of kind of where you stand in regards to that. And we'll talk a little bit about strategies in just a second. But these are some of the benefits. You can see that it's not just disease risk and cancer risk. It's a lot of other things as well in regards to improved mood and cognitive function, better sleep, circulation. There's a whole host of benefits that come along with it. And I can tell you that most of my patients that come to me that are engaging in physical activity, you know, initially that startup is always really hard, but I've never had someone come back to me and say, I really regretted doing that. So there really is a whole host of benefits, but it's just a matter of putting it into action. So here are some ways during the holiday season that you can actually get that going. So keep it moving. You might volunteer to serve or deliver meals or gifts to the community, and that, of course, brings on a whole host of feelings of gratitude and humility, if you will. So that's a great option to do. You might take a walking tour of the holiday lights. If it's safe for you, you could go ice skating. And we also say to be realistic over and over and over again. So break it up, because a lot of times we tend to think about what we have been capable of doing at some point in our lives and not realize that we're not quite in the same point, especially if you just come out of treatment. A lot of times we're a little bit deconditioned. And so it's important to take things slow, start slow. And if you break it up in 10 to 15 minute increments to reach your 30-minute goal, we see in the literature that is just as effective. You might take holiday shopping and preparation offline and into the store, because that's just a great way to keep moving. And then all of those basic things that you might be doing to prepare for a gathering or a party or that sort of thing, or just the basic daily activities of daily living. These are all the things to help keep us active. So trying to not sleep as much, that sort of thing, trying not to give in to fatigue, which is very real after treatment, just pushing back a little bit. And then staying positive about your efforts. I think this is so interesting. A Harvard study found that those who were simply told that they did enough in their daily lives to meet the Surgeon General's recommendations, they lost weight and body fat without consciously changing a thing. So really that just goes to show that believing your efforts are having a positive effect can actually lead to subtle changes. So try not to get really discouraged about what you have or have not been able to do. And if you have a typical routine that you do as far as your physical activity or a workout regimen, don't get discouraged about things getting in the way, and just try and stay positive about all the things you are doing. So here's our next poll. How many calories do you think are typically consumed in a holiday meal? So the correct answer is 3,000 calories. which is astonishing that, even these numbers that I put up here, we're really talking about values that are, maybe at 2,000 or 2,500 if somebody was going through treatment, but for most people, 3,000 calories is above and beyond what their needs actually are. But that's just one holiday meal, and when we think about all the things that we add butters and creams to and cheese, that sort of thing, we're really loading in what we would consider to be energy-dense foods. And that's this third guideline, and it's to avoid sugary drinks and limit consumption of energy-dense foods. And what we mean by energy density is ounce for ounce, there is a higher energy, or what we consider to be calories, on our nutrition facts labels. That's the value for the volume. So ounce for ounce, there's a higher amount of calories in that food. And if you were to think about something like an apple, let's say, and compare that to a donut is something that's considered to be pretty light in weight. And if you were to compare that to an apple, for the same amount of weight that you could take away an apple to match the donut, and you were to compare the amount of calories in those two things, you were going to get far more calories in something like a donut as opposed to that small portion, ounce for ounce in the apple. And what we also see is that those types of foods that are more energy dense, they often tend to be higher in calories and lower in vitamins and minerals. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but our vitamins and minerals are part of what's so protective about our foods and our diet. And these foods are often attributed to weight gain. So that's one of the reasons that we really want to limit the consumption of these foods in general for the guidelines. And then the concern over sugar. I hear a lot in the clinic that sugar feeds cancer, or that sugar is something that needs to be eliminated from the diet entirely. And sugar and cancer is a topic that is often really taken to an extreme, but sugar does provide fuel for all cells in our body, and it's terribly difficult for us to actually discriminate from cancer cells and discriminate from the regular cells in our body, our healthy cells. And what we do know is that we do want to limit added sugar from the diet, and I have guidelines there for you, but limiting all sugars, there have been no studies that have demonstrated that sugar consumption will make cancer worse, and no studies have demonstrated that eliminating it from the diet will actually shrink cancer or make it disappear. So sometimes I think there's an overemphasis on how we perceive our diet and the sugar in our diets. But what we do know is that sugar in excess consumption often leads to excess calories, which leads to excess weight. So this all goes back to that first guideline that we talked about, is making sure that we're maintaining our body weight and making sure that we're as lean as we can possibly be. So there are guidelines. If you're the type of person that you really don't consume sugary drinks, or don't add a lot of sugar to your foods, but you add a little bit of brown sugar, let's say, to your oatmeal in the morning, there's an allotment for that. And that's where these guidelines at that last bullet point come from, which is 6 teaspoons for women and 9 teaspoons for men. And again, this is added sugar. And another point I want to make is that when we talk about sugar too, we're talking about all types of sugar. So whether it is brown sugar, or whether it is honey, or whether it's agave, there's some discussion on whether these sugars are healthier over table sugar, but the reality is that it's still sugar. So dextrose, fructose, syrup, sugar, and sweeteners, those types of ingredients on the labels are going to clue you in that those foods have added sugar to them. And that's really what this guideline is getting at, to avoid the excess. So during this season, one of the things, or some of the things, there's obviously a whole list of things here for you to kind of focus on, but consider doing things like infusing water with holiday flavors, things like cinnamon, ginger, pomegranate, rosemary, and apples. And I'll tell you what's interesting is that sometimes people turn their nose up at the idea of this, but even we see it in some of our cafes, or even some of our our restaurants and so forth. We're starting to see infused water available, and it flies off of the shelves, which is so interesting, or flies out of the carafe, if you will. It's hard to keep it stocked up because people do really appreciate just a hint of something with their water. And you could even do it with like a sparkling water to add a little bit of a fizz, and that's something you could do in place of, let's say, like a fruit punch. Some other things are to use replacements. So a lot of these are replacements for some of our higher calorie or higher fat options. So for your gravy, you might refrigerate it. And typically you'll see that thick layer on the top of fat in the gravy. And you can actually skim some of that off and you actually save yourself quite a bit of calories. You could use almonds as a topping for green bean casserole. You could use 2 egg whites in place of 1 egg with cooking and save calories there. And for every little effort that you do in this regard, you're actually cutting down a much larger subset of calories than what most people realize. I'll just tell you, over at Thanksgiving holiday, my father had actually handed me a recipe that he wanted me to make at his table as we were preparing for the holiday meal, and I actually accidentally replaced, because he had all the ingredients on the table, I replaced heavy cream with evaporated milk, and it was creamed corn. It actually ended up being really tasty, and nobody even noticed the difference, and we actually laughed about it later because my dad said, you know, why do we have heavy cream left over? So that's just one example of how you can start to make adjustments, and it doesn't always have to really compromise the dish. Guideline 4 is to eat more of a variety of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. And this is a guideline I think we hear so much about everywhere we go, with public campaigns on the television, in our magazines, and so on and so forth, is to just, you know, really get those fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes in. We hear it so much. But what I really like to, you know, something that since being an oncology dietitian that I've really learned is that these are the foods that are protecting our bodies. These are the foods that contain the nutrients that are protecting our cells from damage. And the guidelines are, you know, 2/3 of your plate, if we're talking about, you know, a 9-inch plate. It should be vegetables, and we are moving more towards kind of plant-based diets, not necessarily a vegetarian diet, but really just trying to put more emphasis on the fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes that we are consuming on a day-to-day basis. So striving to do those whole grains and legumes at every meal is also another recommendation, which with the sugar thing that I was talking about earlier, sometimes people take that to the next level with grains and carbohydrates as a whole, but in reality, whole grains add great value to our foods because they are unaltered and they do have a large value when it comes to things like fiber and other nutrients. For my fruits and vegetables, especially when we talk about non-starchy ones, our phytochemicals and antioxidants are the huge players in what I was talking about in being protective. And most of your antioxidants, I shouldn't say most, but a large number of your antioxidants will come in the form of vitamins and minerals. Vitamins A, C, E, you know, your minerals, zinc and selenium, they actually have the ability to act like antioxidants. And so there's those that you get from your fruits and vegetables and beans and that sort of thing. But some of the antioxidants are actually what we consider to be phytochemicals. But phytochemicals are actually, you know, beneficial. They're not something that we consider to be essential. They're not something that we consider to weigh or put on the nutrition facts label, for example. But we do know that they do things like stimulate the immune system and slow the growth rate of cancer and prevent DNA damage, all of which are important when we talk about risk reduction for disease in general as well as cancer. So trying to get more of these into the menus and into your life during the holiday season, because we have so many creamy things, so many starchy things going on. These are just some suggestions on how to actually, you know, include these things. So you might consider having a crudité platter, which is, you know, something like carrots with celery and that sort of thing with a Greek yogurt-based dip prior to a meal. And doing so is going to provide those phytonutrients that we're talking about, antioxidants, but it's also going to give you a source of fiber and protein that will help you keep fuller longer, and that'll help you be more realistic about the foods that you are eating and the portions in which you end up eating later. And then you could do things like enjoy citrus fruits such as oranges, lemons, and limes. And the reason for doing that would be, of course, something like vitamin C and bioflavonoids, and especially during this time period, not just for cancer risk, but also that provides a great value when it comes to our immune health. So making sure that we actually have these nutrients before we get sick is the best way to prevent, you know, illnesses moving forward, to boost our immune health. And after all, this is flu season, so definitely a good decision to do. Providing and enjoying a berry salad or dark chocolate covered fruit for dessert, that's a great way to add a dessert as opposed to something like, a chocolate mousse pie, for example. And you'll get your vitamin C and of course antioxidants there. And then these last three here, you're going to save calories by adding, fiber, folic acid, protein, and phytochemicals, which provide a whole range of healthful benefits. And again, these foods are known to be protective in our disease risk, and particularly in developing cancer. This fifth guideline is to limit consumption of red meats and avoid processed meat. When we talk about high consumption of processed meats as well as red meat, we're talking about the link to cancer incidence, and we're actually really talking about colorectal cancer as the whole. That's really where the data is coming from. There really isn't any data, truthfully, on progression and or recurrence of colorectal cancer as far as the consumption of red meats and processed meats. So we don't see that it gets worse or that it comes back because of consumption of these foods. It's really just the incidence of developing that type of cancer. And so the recommendation is to limit the consumption to 18 ounces per week of red meat. And when we think about what that portion is for meat in general, it's 3 ounces, which is about the size of a woman's palm or even a deck of cards. And if you think about that, that's really a pretty large allotment for red meat throughout the week, because you could have 3 ounces 6 days out of the week if you did it once a day. And so it's something that I think sometimes we get really, really hung up on, but we consider the volume that is in a week. It's really not that much of a restriction. Unless you're the type of person that likes to go out and enjoy a really big steak, a couple of times a week, then that's where we get into a little bit of trouble. So just, again, that kind of goes back to the whole mantra of moderation, right? So, and then there is no concrete guideline for processed meat. It's really just to limit or avoid it. And that's really just where we stand on that. So if you're the type of person that tends to enjoy a lot of things like bacon or hot dogs, that sort of thing, meats that have been smoked, cured, or salted, you just really want to try and cut back on that. And then this last guideline on cooking at very high temperatures, the data is actually a little bit muddy on that, if you will. It's been studied in animals, but the data is less clear in humans. We have some literature to support it and some that doesn't quite favor it as heavily. But what is thought to happen is that when you cook animal tissue at really, really high temperatures, it can create these heterocyclic amines, and they're known to be carcinogenic. And so cooking at very high temperatures is something that we don't know necessarily that we actually need to really truly limit or exclude from our methods, but it's just wise if you're going to if you're going to weigh this with any kind of weight, that we just cut back on it. It wouldn't hurt to do so. So through the holiday, you might consider going meatless at some meals throughout the day. That's one way to actually get us back to the fruits and vegetables thing that I was talking about earlier, and also just limit our consumption of certain meats in general. And then prepare those meats low and slow, so just avoid frying, which is going to add a large number of calories and fat in general, and then grilling. So you might get that back to just a few days a week if you're the type of person that tends to do it very often. And then be mindful of the portion of your plate that's dedicated to meat, which we talked about earlier, the 2/3 of the plate that's being dedicated to the fruit, vegetables, beans, and whole grains. But that other 1/3 is where you get the serving of meat, allotted for your protein foods in general, actually. And then that recommended serving is 3 ounces or a deck of cards. But the big thing that I really want you to take away during the holiday season is that, as you heard me say earlier, there's no data on progression and or recurrence when it comes to colorectal cancer. We do have an allotment for red meat in the diet, and there's no concrete guideline when it comes to how much processed meat we're allowed or allotted to consume. And so enjoying something like a ham at a holiday meal or a hot dog at some type of ball game is not actually going to be detrimental to your health. So it is okay to still enjoy those foods on occasion. It's just a matter of looking at your diet and where you stand and kind of assessing where you need to make modifications if some of these things are maybe in excess. All right, so for our next poll, which of the following is a risk factor for cancer? So if consumed at all, so the actual answer is all of the above. And I think most people would definitely say cigarette smoking and sun exposure, but what most people don't realize is that alcohol consumption is attributed to cancer risk, and only 30% of individuals tend to realize that that's a truth. And when we look at the guideline 6, it's if consumed at all, limit alcoholic drinks to no more than 2 for men and 1 for women. And the key part of that sentence is if consumed at all. And I think we live in a society that's, supportive of alcohol consumption, and we tend to make jokes about it quite frequently, about it being 5 o'clock somewhere, or, just needing to have a drink after a really hard day. But we are seeing so much more literature that alcohol consumption is actually attributed to cancer risk. And so you'll see on the next slide, I've got some information on what that means, but it's really dose dependent. So the more alcohol that you consume, the greater that risk tends to be. And so the guideline was actually developed when we say, no more than 2 for men and 1 for women. That really actually comes from, we know that greater alcohol consumption is attributed to cancer risk, but we also know that alcohol consumption in certain types of cancers, in very small amounts, and also in heart disease, can actually have some protective benefits. So there's a little bit of a conundrum there, and it's just about kind of weighing your overall risk. The other thing, too, is that alcohol consumption can lessen your inhibition and lead to overindulgence when it comes to meals. And just like we were talking about earlier with the different portions and that sort of thing, if we're limiting or lessening our inhibition, we're a little less able to kind of identify where we have been and where we should be as far as our meals go. And this is that slide that I was telling you about. And so you can really see here that so, for example, with something like voice box cancer, less than or 1 drink a day is, a smaller risk. It actually has almost a protective benefit because it's less than 1, that value there, when it comes to cancer risk for voice box cancer. But you see that it's greater in some of these other cancers. And the important thing to take away here, and I think this is the part that's often missed, is that you have to consider this is just teasing out the piece of alcohol consumption. And a lot of times we also carry other risk factors that may be familial based or genetic based, and maybe other lifestyle factors, like we talked about weight earlier in the presentation. And so when you start to add some of these things up, these numbers, they compound over time for what we'd consider an absolute risk. And I don't have those values for you here, but this is really just to give you an idea of what that looks like. Just look at mouth and throat cancer. If heavy consumption of greater than 4 drinks per day, you're really talking about a great risk for mouth and throat cancer. So really the bottom line for everyone, through the holiday season is if you don't drink, it wouldn't be wise to start. And if you do drink, then try and drink less. All right, so our next poll, sea salt has a lower sodium content than table salt. True or false? So the answer is false. Surprisingly, I have a large number of individuals that will consume or, include in their diet sea salt because they think it has less sodium in it. But really, when we consider, weight for weight, sea salt actually doesn't have less salt in it or sodium in it than our salt does, and the same is true for something like kosher salt. But the guideline here is to limit consumption of salty foods and foods processed with salt or sodium in general. And studies have found that high sodium intake can damage the lining of the stomach. And so that's the theory there, and it's how it's being attributed to stomach cancer. And so we were looking at 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, and you'll actually see that in other diseases too. So the American Heart Association also recommends that. And two, when we look at just general healthful guidelines across the general population, that is also a recommendation. So the challenge, however, is that average sodium consumption is around 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day. And if you look at just 1 teaspoon of salt, it has 2,300 milligrams of sodium, which is this guideline. So very, very quickly, we can end up with a lot of sodium in our diet, and that's why, we tend to be, 1,100 milligrams over the daily or over the recommendation. The benefit, I will tell you, however, is that sea salt comes with a caveat that the crystals tend to be larger. And so when you're measuring out something like sea salt with measuring spoons, for example, you actually are going, because the crystals are larger, when you put that in that teaspoon, you're going to have more negative space because they're bulky. And so to that extent, you might actually end up with a little bit less sodium in that teaspoon as opposed to your regular table iodized salt. And so for that reason, you might end up with a little less sodium. And also sea salt tends to have a little bit of a stronger flavor. So again, that's another benefit in that sense that if you're looking for a little bit of a heightened flavor and you're using, measuring spoons to measure this sort of thing out, you're actually going to end up with, a lesser amount of sodium than what maybe your palate is looking for. So those are really truthfully the benefits of doing something like sea salt and concluding that. And salt is a learned behavior. So the more and more you consume salt, or the more and more you allow for a heightened salt flavor, you actually are going to end up, having a desire for it more, or creating this baseline of your standard for how much salt should be in foods. And if you've ever really truly gotten away from salt and then tried something that in the past you would have enjoyed, you actually will find that it's rather shocking, if you will. And so it's one of those things that can be learned and can be adjusted for. It's just a matter of making that effort. So we want to limit our consumption of salty foods and that are processed with salt through the holidays. And one of these, I think, is what a really great tip is that during a holiday meal, people typically include something like ham on the menu. And one of the things you can do is actually to soak it in cold water overnight, and that will actually help to pull out the sodium from that ham. And the more water changes you do, the more sodium you're going to pull out of the ham. It's obviously not going to pull all the salt out, and the flavor will certainly still be there. But that's one thing that you can do to help lessen the amount of sodium in that dish. And then keep in mind that any foods that have been boxed, bagged, or canned, they're processed with salt. So look for low sodium varieties. Most of our holiday meal dishes are made with things like chicken broths and cream of chicken or cream of mushroom, or cream of mushroom soups, or chicken noodle soup, that sort of thing. We use those as a base for a large variety of dishes, and they do have low sodium, or what we consider, you'll see on the labels oftentimes, heart-healthy varieties. So those are available. So if you're able to make a substitution, that would be wise to do so there. And then salt is used to heighten the flavors in culinary arts. So that's the whole purpose of adding salt to food, is to heighten the other flavors that would be, relatively mundane otherwise. And so if you were to actually make your own gravy, not only are you getting away from having to use something that is salt preserved in a jar, let's say. So you're getting away from that volume of sodium, but you're also able to control how much sodium you put in there. And then when you add other things like garlic, onion, or chives to that gravy, you don't have to use as much salt. There's a great deal of flavor there that you can just use to heighten. And then many seasoning blends, things like poultry seasoning, for example, they add salt to those seasoning blends. So check out those ingredients that are on the back of that label. And you could also replicate the recipes. So if you look on the internet for, just as an example, taco seasoning is something really easy that you can actually make your own taco seasoning with, the individual ingredients, and then you can cut back on the sodium or cut it out entirely, depending on your preference. And those are some ways to actually limit your salty consumption during the holidays. And this last guideline is to Not use supplements to protect against cancer. And this is another big question that I often hear about in the clinic, but supplements are not recommended unless a deficiency is identified or suspected. There are some circumstances in which something like vitamin D, for example, for those that don't have a whole lot of sun exposure or should not be having any sun exposure, sunlight exposure, you'd want to supplement with something like vitamin D, or there's some other deficiency that's recognized, or perhaps there's a lab value that's been run, for example, with like iron, folate, B12, that sort of thing, that we need to actually be fortifying the diet with a supplement because for whatever reason we're not able to absorb enough, or another type of treatment is diminishing that value. That's when supplements are recommended, and those are typically vitamin and mineral supplements. But intake beyond our normal levels of a vitamin mineral recommendation can actually have harmful effects. And this also plays into herbal supplements as well. So Eastern medicine does have the ability to be very powerful in some of the things that they have been attributed to. But when you combine that with Western medicine, sometimes you can have some really harmful side effects. And so it's always wise to not only speak to your physician about those supplements, but also, there's the Memorial Sloan Kettering Center. They actually have great herbal guidelines out there that actually will show you kind of what the harmful effects are and to look into your supplements a little bit. Labdoor.com is also a really great independent reviewer of supplements because the supplement industry is not regulated and we don't always know the quality or the quantity of what's being put in our supplements. So we just have to be very cautious about the supplements that we're selecting. So either talk to your physicians or use some of these other resources to kind of investigate a little bit further. And then two, we know that isolated nutrients have not been conclusively shown to have benefit. So sometimes we take a nutrient that we know has antioxidant properties or anti-inflammatory properties, when consumed or when put in an isolated environment and studied that way. But sometimes when we take it in a supplement form, we actually see that it doesn't quite work the same way, and that getting that nutrient from food is better absorbed because there's another nutrient that actually helps it to be absorbed and utilized. So getting your nutrients from your food is absolutely the best option. So you would want to pack, these foods into your holiday season. And the American Institute of Cancer Research has this section on their website. If you go to aicr.org and then you click on Reduce Your Cancer Risk, under there is a link for foods that fight cancer. And if you're curious about what foods have which components to them that are cancer fighting, they will give you a whole host of examples. And so I pulled all the ones that were really holiday specific. So maybe you just you could do something like apples and you could bake them and then do something like a little bit of cinnamon to them so they're sweet and they've kind of caramelized a little bit, from baking or cooking. And you've added great flavor, and now you've got this great dish that has all these great nutrients to them. Or adding garlic. Garlic is attributed to reduction of inflammation and also has antimicrobial properties. So there's a lot of great benefits in including that in your meals. So those are just some examples of how you can work those in and how they're so beneficial to our health. So rather than relying on something like a supplement, using these foods instead are actually even more beneficial because of their synergistic effects. So that was all the guidelines. Through the holiday season, it's something that when we look at the diet as a whole, there's a bigger piece outside of just the foods that we select. So there's some things that I pulled some tips that I really just feel like are very helpful when it comes to the overall diet and the overall attitude that you go into the season with. So balancing special treats with smarter choices. You might focus on the seasonal foods at a holiday meal and decide to forego the everyday foods. So if green bean casserole is not something that you get all year round and it's something that you really want to enjoy, enjoy that, and then maybe forego some of the other foods that are so commonly or readily available to you, so that way you're keeping the calories in check. And keep in mind the or rather than and. And what I mean by that is when we look at our menu, sometimes we might have 3 different types or 3 different ways that we've prepared potatoes. And so maybe you decide to just do one of those options as opposed to all three of those options. And then keep your portions small. In doing so, you'll actually get to that, you'll actually get yourself into what we consider to be a one-plate rule during the holiday season. Sometimes we see the things that we really, really enjoy and we're hungry by the time we get to that meal, and then we really portion out something larger, and then you get to the end of the buffet line and you think, oh, I really wanted to get to this food item, and then you have to go back for seconds. So keep your portions really small, and that'll help you keep to one plate during the holiday. And then sit near someone to keep you accountable. And this goes back to the physical activity too. So if you know someone that will keep you accountable, somebody that you can go on a walk with, someone that shares the same goals that you have, that would be wise of you to invest some of your time and attention to that individual. And talking to them through the meal, you actually might eat less and actually realize that you're full sooner. So those would all be advantageous. And then plan ahead and don't skip your meals. And this not only during the holiday season, but I really tell everyone, all of my patients to do this, but keeping a lunchbox available to you for snacks to carry while you're away from home is a really good idea. And sometimes it might even just be in your glove compartment. It just really depends on how hot it is and what type of foods we're talking about. But making sure that you have snacks on hand for when you're really hungry is very helpful to keep you from feeling famished and then just overindulging at the next meal. And then go lighter on the next meal. If you at a holiday meal or at a party or something of that nature, you really do indulge and you enjoy that meal, which I hope you did, at the next meal, then you want to just go lighter on it. And don't let that one meal spoil your efforts, because sometimes we have a tendency to just throw it all to the wind and say, well, I messed up, so I'm just going to enjoy everything to the fullest and just give up on all the goals. So try not do that. And then if you are the person that's planning meals and preparing for meals, give those leftovers to your family. So come up with a plan beforehand to have some type of doggy bag that you can actually distribute, and that will help so that way you're not eating it all week long. And then bring your own healthful dish to the event or meal. Sometimes it's so nice at a party to have that health dish. So sometimes if you just bring the fruit, or sometimes if you just bring like the crudité platter, people tend to really dive into those foods and really enjoy them. And not only that, but you also have the opportunity for yourself to kind of count on one dish at least that you know that you've really made an impact on, especially when it comes to things like fruits and vegetables. So that's the advantage there. And then popping a mint in your mouth. So this is probably one of my favorites, is that we're not always great about paying attention to our satiety cues. So at the end of a meal, if you've eaten a little bit and you're kind of chatting, sometimes if we're sitting at the meal, we may continue to just keep munching on things because they're in front of us. But if we were to actually use a mint and pop one of those in our mouths, sometimes we actually find that we are less inclined to keep eating. So those are just some of the tips and tricks I would say to kind of move forth with. But this is the holiday season and you should enjoy it to the best of your ability. I hope that I was able to share some useful information to help you embrace nutrition and take the fear out of the foods that we encounter on a daily basis. This is an excellent slide if you'd like to continue learning and get more information on what was presented today. There are a number of resources here that are credible and certainly worthy of looking into. So there's a lot of really great information here. But I thank you all so much for having me, and I really do want to wish you all a very happy holiday season. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to our organizers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Oh, you're so welcome.
At this time, we're going to answer a few questions that came in. The first one, we were asked, what types of cancer are caused by alcohol?
So that actually goes back to all of them, the ones on the slide that I presented to you all earlier. Mouth cancer, and it's dose dependent too. So when we talk about breast, we talk about colon, rectal, liver, esophageal, mouth, and throat, that sort of thing. So those have I would say the biggest impact by alcohol consumption.
Awesome. And then another question we got, if I don't have access to a dietitian at my cancer center, who should I reach out to in order to get a plan for my diet?
So one of the resources that's actually on the handouts from the slides, oncologynutrition.org, it actually gives a resource to everyone of dietitians that are available that specialize in oncology. And so that's one of the best ways to get in touch with someone is, or you can go to eatright.org, which is the Academy of Dietitians, and you can actually search through their available experts that are, they kind of do private practice, if you will, so they could actually meet with you by phone, some of them, and some of them do it in person by your location.
Awesome. And there was one more question. Do you have any good resources for finding healthy holiday meals?
Yes, and they're actually on the resource list that I just had on that last slide. The American Institute of Cancer Research actually has a whole section dedicated to recipes that are just packed full of those, those power-packed foods and nutrients that kind of we talked about earlier. And two, while you're there, you can just look and see just how beneficial some of those are based on the food ingredient. But yes, that AICR.org is where is one place you can go at least for recipes. You could go to oncologynutrition.org as well for just general healthful nutrition recipes for preventing cancer. But that AICR is currently geared towards holiday recipes.
Very good. All right, well, those are all of the questions that came in. Just so the audience knows, we can take the slides with the resources and we can send those to you in a follow-up email so all of you can have access to that as well. And then I believe Natalie O'Rourke is going to close us out.
Yes, Nicole. Well, first, Nicole, let me thank you for being our guinea pig, being our first presenter on the very first Survive and Thrive webinar. Thank you. I love listening to you, and when you have spoken at our symposiums, the feedback that we always get is that you are so thoughtful and you're so encouraging in delivering the content. And so, and you did it again. You did a great job, and we appreciate you. I want to thank everyone who participated and signed up for this webinar. This will be a monthly program, so the webinar will be monthly. We'll do a very quick follow-up. We're nailing down some of the speakers for the first half of the year, but we're going to have some great topics: finances, getting back into your career after cancer, intimacy beyond cancer. So I think that there's something for everyone, and if you know anybody that would be interested in learning about this information or attending one of our symposiums, please refer them to our website and to connect with us on Facebook. So thank you again for Nicole for hosting us, and then thank you again to the audience for participating. The best way for us to improve these types of programs is with your feedback. And so at the close of this webinar, a survey will open up on your screen. I know it's the end of the day, you're tired, you want to get home, it's definitely cold if you're anywhere in Texas right now. So take a minute, stay indoors, answer the survey, give us the feedback. We really, really appreciate it, as well as any other topics that you'd like to see covered in future webinars. So thank you so much, Kelly, wonderful job. Again, Nicole, awesome. Thank y'all and have a wonderful holiday season.